and people are joining. Oh, there we go. So the recording is there.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Stefanie, for giving us your time and sharing. You're going to share with us your experience. And we're very happy to have all our students and faculty who have been able to join us this evening. Dr. Stefanie Arndt is a sea ice physicist at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Helmholtz Centre for the Polar and Marine Research in Bremerhaven. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing
That's totally
anything.
fine.
Yeah. She also lectures in the Sea Ice Physics Master's Degree program at the University of Hamburg. She was born in Berlin and studied meteorology in Berlin and Hamburg, as well as Arctic Geophysics in a master's block course on Spitsbergen. In 2017, she completed her doctorate at the University of Bremen and the Alfred Wegener Institute Seasonal Arctic and Antarctic Surface Properties and their influence on the under ice light field. During her doctorate, she spent 3 months at IMAS, the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in Hobart, Tasmania. So she's also active in various national and international networks, including the German representative at the Association of the Polar's Early Career Scientists, the Year of the Polar Prediction, and the International Working Group's Antarctic Fast Ice Network, and many others. And she gives TV talks and appearances and many public events. And I had the privilege of meeting Stefanie in Berlin last month at the Falling Walls Summit. And I was so taken away by your talk that I had to bring you to my students so that they could have a taste of your journey and what you're doing, because it's so exciting. And it rekindles our curiosity that we evolved, and that's how we survived. So Stefanie, the floor is yours. Please go ahead. And then students, if you have questions, write them down. And then once Stefanie's done, we can then share them. You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask the question, and Stefanie will answer. And we have almost at least 50 minutes for the whole event.
Perfect.
Thank you, Stefanie.
Thanks a lot for those kind introducing words. Yeah, well, so this saves me at least time to introduce myself. So I think you can see now my shared screen, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, so as mentioned, I'm a sea ice physicist here in Bremerhaven in Germany, northern part of Germany. And I was lucky to be part of the biggest Arctic expedition we've done since, human beings are on that planet. The so-called MOSAiC expedition, where we froze our German icebreaker that you can see here on the image into the Arctic Ocean to drift with the ice and to study the whole system for 1 year, which was super exciting. And I was part of that expedition for a couple of months. And the period that I spent in the Arctic got increased by like a couple of months, given the fact that there was Corona, as we all know, and Corona caused that, I couldn't come back home. So I just simply stayed longer in the Arctic, which was fine because, I'm kind of used to work in the polar region. So until now, so I'm 33 years old, and so far I joined already 10 ship-based expeditions and 2 other land-based expeditions. So I spent like more than 2 years of my whole life so far in the Arctic and Antarctic. So therefore, I would call that kind of my third home after Berlin and Bremerhaven. So, but why are we doing the studies? And this is how I want to introduce my talk today. I think also in the region where you are from, where I've unfortunately never been so far, we are all aware of the climate change and that the whole Earth is warming. And this warming happens like all over the place. And we are currently at an average increase in temperature of about 1 degree. When we average the global warming over the whole planet. However, if we look, as shown in this image here, into the polar regions, especially into the Arctic, we do see that we observe in the Arctic really like the strongest part of the global warming, so that we can really say that the Arctic is kind of the epicenter of global warming, because here the surface temperatures raised the surface temperatures did not only raise for 1 degree as it's done for the whole world, but in the Arctic it's up to 2 to 3 times stronger than all over the place. So meaning we have here an increase of about 2 to 3 degrees already today, and we are facing much warmer temperatures when we continue with the CO2 emissions and so on. So what does that mean for the Arctic, for the Arctic in general? We, of course, do see on the one hand the warming in the atmosphere, but one essential part of the Arctic climate system is the Arctic sea ice. And the Arctic sea ice, this is what you can see here in that image now, decreased over the past decades dramatically, so that we observe today about 50% less sea ice in the Arctic, meaning really the frozen Arctic Ocean is covered just only half of it during summertime as we observed it by the end of the 1970s. However, now the question is, how is this going to continue? And this is why we had all these those big climate conferences, as for example in 2015 and the one in Paris, or the just finished COP conference in Glasgow this year, where really stakeholders, politicians and scientists came together and discussed how should we continue and how will, for example, the Arctic sea ice extent continue if we continue to do CO2 emissions as we did so far, and as we therefore foster the increasing air temperatures. So therefore, when we come to that point and we just continue as we do so far, it might happen that we in a couple of years observe that in the Arctic summer there's no Arctic sea ice at all, meaning that the North Pole is during summertime not ice covered at all, but there's just a blue big ocean. And this is of course not part of the game that we want to play, because we in general want to decrease the temperature increase overall. We want to decrease CO2 emissions, and we therefore want to increase the sea ice extent both in summer and in winter, of course. But especially in summer, we see all these huge problems so far. So, however, now of course the question is, why should we care about the Arctic? I mean, especially also for you guys, of course, the Arctic is pretty far away, but we can't see it like that, because in the end, we are globally connected. So we can't just talk about the Arctic or just about Germany or Jordanian or whatever, but we always have to see it as a global thing, because we are all connected through the atmospheric circulation pattern in the Arctic, in the atmosphere, and through the currents in the ocean. And therefore, if we do observe changes in the Arctic, they are also transported down to the middle latitudes, for example, by the so-called jet stream, which is in normal case kind of separating the cold air masses up in the Arctic from the warmer air masses in the higher latitudes and the lower latitudes. And therefore, if this kind of stream is starting to decrease, to get slower and so on, this courses, then in the end, for example, that we have cold air breaks down in the US or also in mid-Europe, for example, and vice versa, that we then also transport warmer air again to the Arctic, which is not kind of part of the system there. So what I basically want to say is that we can't only think about one part of the globe, but we always have to see it at once, because we are all connected. So if we observe changes in the Arctic, they will also in the end hit Earth in one or the other direction. And even though the Arctic is so important when we think about global change, and as I said, so we do observe already there, already today, the highest increase in the temperatures, despite the fact that it's so important, we still don't know that many details about the Arctic. So there are still so many uncertainties, and especially when we then, for example, look into our climate models, which gives us kind of ideas and projections of how will the Arctic look in 10 to 15 to 20 to 50 to 100 years from now, You can see here now that the uncertainties, especially in the Arctic, here in the right-hand part of the plot, they are really the biggest ones. So we do know, or what we observe overall is we will have a further warming of the Arctic, but the uncertainty is huge, and this uncertainty then, of course, also propagates back in our latitudes. And this is why it is so important that we get a closer or better understanding of what is happening in the Arctic. But the big problem was so far, or is so far, that if we want to understand the Arctic climate system, we really want to understand the whole connection, the whole thing about it. So not only the atmosphere, not only the ocean, not only the sea ice, but everything around it. And this entire system, not only at one day in the year, but really for a whole year. But even though we have this strong climate change in the Arctic, during winter time, we are normal case, it's not possible for us to go to the North Pole, because this is when we still have the thick sea ice sitting in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. And this is why we thought, okay, what can we do about it? How can we get to the North Pole also in winter time? And this is when we then came to the point that, okay, there was about 130 years ago, there was Fridtjof Nansen, who took his wooden boat, the so-called Fram, to the Arctic, and he wanted to see whether there are land masses on the North Pole or not. So he was looking for a crew that would drift with him and his ship for an uncertain time period. So it was not clear for how long they would drift and whether they would meet in the end at the North Pole pure ice and ocean masses, or whether they would really find land. So we do know today that there is, of course, no land, but it's just ocean and ice. But this experience took him 3 years. So they drifted for 3 years with this wooden ship that you can see here on the left-hand side. And now we had this idea of him into mind, and we said, okay, we can do something similar. But of course, we do not want to see whether there's land or not, but we want to understand the climate system in the Arctic. And we want to use, therefore, a fully equipped modern icebreaker to do that expedition. And this is exactly what we did. And it was and this project is called MOSAiC, so the Multidisciplinary Drifting Observatory for the Study of Arctic Climate. And this immense, huge expedition was only possible because we had our German icebreaker, but we had especially the cooperation of about 20 countries all over the world that helped with the effort of that expedition. So what was the logistics, or what was the idea behind this expedition? So we took our German icebreaker in September 2019, started in Tromsø in Norway, and went into the Arctic sea ice. And we were accompanied by a Russian icebreaker, which built up around the ship a so-called network of autonomous ice stations that can measure properties in the ice, in the atmosphere and in the ocean, without us being there and measuring, but they measure it and they transmit it via satellite. And this whole system was then meant to drift for 1 year through the Arctic Ocean. And along that path, we wanted to do our research. We wanted to understand the system better. The entire expedition was only possible because we had, as I said, on the one hand, of course, a lot of scientific collaborations, but also logistically, because we wanted to exchange people in between. So the whole year was put into six legs, so to say, to exchange people, to get new food on the ship, to get also new equipment. And then in addition, we planned for additional aircraft campaigns starting from Greenland and from Spitsbergen. However, they had to be cancelled also given the corona pandemic situation that we were then facing. So this was the logistical concept of the expedition. And now coming into the science. So scientifically, and this was one of the big strengths of that expedition, that was really that we did not only had one team focusing on one specific topic, but that we had so many different teams looking in all perspectives into the Arctic climate system. So we had on the one hand the people from the atmosphere understanding and studying everything about clouds, about precipitation, about radiation transfer, about everything that you can imagine in the topic of atmospheric science. We had then the sea ice team, which I was part of, where we studied all processes in the sea ice. How is it growing? How thick is it? What is living in the ice? Also this is part of the sea ice physics. How thick is the snow on top, and all these questions. We had then the ocean team who studied like really the liquid water beneath the sea ice. How warm is it? How salty is it? How is it changing over time? We had then the ecosystem people that looked even more into detail. What is living in the ice? What is living beneath the ice? What is living in the upper ocean column? And then we had the group of so-called biogeochemistry. So they looked into fluxes between all these different components of that complex climate system. So this was the scientific concept of the expedition, and this is how we started. And this is how it looked then when we went into that expedition. So you can see here in the foreground our German icebreaker, the Polarstern, which was our home base for that whole expedition. And you can see in the back those different colored tents, and this was kind of really our cities, our infrastructure on the ice, where we really did our research. So how did that look in detail? So you can see here just a glimpse into Met City. So Met City was everything about meteorology, so about the atmosphere. You can see here in the back the tower measuring wind velocities and temperatures in different heights over the sea ice. You can see here measurements also for radiation transfer above and beneath the sea ice. So this this is what was done in Met City. Also part of the meteorological measurement program was so-called Miss Piggy. Miss Piggy is a balloon, a tethered balloon, that was launched from those tents, and where they also had measurement devices to measure, for example, ozone, and again also different particles within the atmosphere when launching the balloon. We had then so-called Ocean City. So this is their main instrument, the CTD rosette, with which they do measure different properties of the ocean column, but also can, with those bottles, take different water samples in different depths of the ocean. We had then so-called ROV City. ROV stands for Remotely Operated Vehicle. And this is what you can see here in the lower image in the back. So this is a small roboter, which can measure from beneath, for example, the sea ice thickness, which can measure from beneath also like the different properties of the upper ocean. But for the biologists, we could also put nets onto the ROV to also fish beneath the sea ice, for example. We did, of course, not only sample beneath the ice, but also above the ice. And therefore, we had 2 helicopters on board. And those we can use, for example, for airborne sea ice thickness surveys. You can see here the helicopter, and then hanging beneath this torpedo-shaped thingy, which we can use for those measurements of sea ice thickness in a radius of about 100 kilometers around the ship. Myself, you could then, in most cases, find whenever it came to what kind ever of snow measurements, because this is my personal kind of research interest. So we took thousands of samples for chemical snow analysis, as for example for black carbon or different other chemical components from the atmosphere that you find back in the snowpack. But also did a lot of physical analysis, meaning what is the temperature gradient, for example, in the snow, or how dense is the snow. So those are all the different, or this is just like to give you an idea on how we worked in the ice. And now I want to go into really kind of the seasonal cycle and the challenges that came with that seasonal cycle and that we experienced on the ice. So you can see now here on the left-hand side, kind of our clock around the year, how the surface changed, and of course also kind of how the light conditions changed, as we of course worked also in pitch dark conditions. And on the right hand side you can see the whole drift of our German icebreaker, here color coded with the different legs for the different periods of the expedition. So then just let's go into the beginning of the drift. And the drift started, so as I said, Polarstern left Tromsø in September 2019, and they found their MOSAiC flow to drift with. They found beginning of October, and then on the 4th of October, this was a super special day for us, because this was the day when Polarstern, so the German icebreaker, shut off their engines, and they started really just to drift and move just by the force of nature, meaning by the drift of the sea ice. And at the same time, the 4th of October was the last day when we saw the sun above the ice. Afterwards, the sun never came back above the horizon until then spring next year. So this is how the whole story started. And then, as I said, so we started like really with the last minutes of daylight, so to say. And then we were really working in the pitch darkness, just in the light of our headlamps and the lights of the ship and of the lights kind of in our tents, in our cities on the ice. But that's basically it. And this is how they worked really from October until end of February. So really for 4.5 to 5 months in pitch darkness. At the same time, so on this picture, it's maybe hard to recognize, but that's me. And this is, so I came into the game with the third part of the drift. So we reached the ship end of February. And this was end of February, beginning of March. And this was also the time when we experienced the coldest temperatures. So I just heard that it's for you currently like 15 down to 10 degrees. And here on that picture, this was our coldest day. And this is much colder than temperatures that you, I guess, used to. So we experienced here temperatures of about minus 42 degrees Celsius measured temperature. But this is not that tough, I can tell you. But what is tough is the felt temperature, the so-called wind chill, which is kind of resulting from the cold air that you feel then on your skin by the wind. And this went in those periods where it was so cold, also from the measured temperatures, those went down to minus 70, so 70 degrees Celsius. So this was super cold. But also here I can tell you, you can get used to it. But yes, you have to be really careful, and also your instruments are sometimes a little bit lazy. So then with the beginning of the third leg, so with the beginning of the leg, I was participating this nice closed sea ice cover kind of went. And what we then experienced was a lot of ice dynamics, meaning that the ice started really moving, scratching, and that we had a lot of those so-called ice leads opening within the vicinity of our camp. So there was a lot of open water that, of course, we did not want to see. But this is also kind of part of the game of this climate change in the Arctic, because the Arctic sea ice is getting thinner, and at the same time, therefore, that it is getting thinner, it's also getting dynamic. It's like more, it's easier for it to break, so to say. And so in the morning, or each morning again, we had to decide whether we would cross such leads in the ice in order to make sure that we can really make it in the end of the day again safe back home to our ship, or whether we are really afraid, because I mean, the lead you can see here is about 20 centimeters wide, 20 to 30 centimeters, but it can then just only like in an hour or two, this can open up to several meters. So therefore you have to be really careful and have really to think about twice what you're doing. And yes, I mean, those dynamics, as I said, so they really followed us through our expedition. Because this is really part of the new Arctic, part of the new game. And then, of course, also part of that new game is that you had at some point to get really kind of creative, how to get to your instruments, how to get to other parts of the flow. So we also use kayaks to paddle down the Arctic Ocean to get to our measurement sites. And whenever you see an opening of the ice, this ice is at some point again drifting back, and you can imagine this drifting back, that it's not working as a puzzle game where it's really just like coming back as it was before, but those ice flows do really crush into each other and really build so-called ice ridges. As you can see it here in the picture, those ice ridges can get several meters high, and it's incredible loud and fascinating to see how they form and to hear how they form. But also this is, at the other hand, again, a part of this changing Arctic, a part of this climate change that we want to stop, of course. So then, end of June, I was in the end back home, and this is then when the fourth part of the expedition started. And with this fourth part of the expedition, we then also entered the spring conditions in the Arctic. And spring in the Arctic means that the whole snow cover on top of the Arctic sea ice is melting. And not only the snow is melting, but also the surface of the ice. And what then form are so-called melt ponds. So this is really like little ponds and puddles, as you can see here, like little lakes, so to say, on the top of the sea ice, which is really kind of a normal spring conditions. However, as you can see here, so the fourth part of this drift was this blue part here. And so they reached already end of July, the marginal ice zone, so really the edge of the ice in the Arctic Ocean. And this is when the whole floe just disintegrated. And so this means that it took us to drift through the whole Arctic. It took us only 300 days. And this is just amazing, I must admit, because when we just think back what I just said, how long Nansen, Fridtjof Nansen, it took 3 years, more than 3 years. And for us, it was only 300 days. So this also shows us how the Arctic is changing, what we could observe. So what they then did, so when they reached the marginal ice zone, the edge of the ice zone, they just had another exchange for the last part of the expedition. And then they went through the ice field back to the North Pole. And this is what you can see here. Also, those conditions at the North Pole are really, kind of part of the game of the climate change again, because in normal years, or like what are normal years, but like 10 to 15 years ago, it was really tough to reach the North Pole because of thick ice, because of compacted ice, and it was really rough also for our icebreaker to get there. However, this year, or like in 2020, it was super easy because the ice was so thin and mobile so that they could easily go across the pole and then find their new MOSAiC flow to continue their measurements, to also capture now, after following the autumn into winter and spring conditions into summer, and now also to capture this transition from summer into autumn conditions. And this is why they had then a drift for another month, from mid of August to mid of September. And so they basically built up the same camp again. And this is then how it looked like already then in beginning of September. You can see here really nicely how autumn kicks in, because all those melt ponds are not that bright anymore. They are getting darker again. And especially their surface gets again more snow covered. So that's really like autumn begins, the melt ponds get frozen and snow covered. And already a couple of days later, you can see here barely any melt ponds at all. You can see here still the infrastructure on the ice. But basically, the whole system is again like snowed in. Yes, the whole seasonal cycle is kind of starting again. But this was also at the same time then the end of our expedition. I mean, we experienced then the whole Arctic season. And so Polarstern left in the end this second MOSAiC flow on the 20th of September. Because they then headed back to Germany, to Bremerhaven, here where I'm based, as Polarstern's home port is Bremerhaven. And then they reached us here on the 12th of October in 2020, and the expedition was over. So this was super exciting. But it was, of course, not only about the excitement, what was this expedition about, but it was, of course, mainly about the data set. And the data set that we brought back is just amazing. I mean, we have about 150 terabytes of data. We have more than 30,000 samples from all different disciplines here that you can imagine. And most of these samples are not even analyzed yet, even though we are back since more than a year. There are still like tons of ice cores and snow samples sitting in the labs all over the world, waiting to be analyzed. However, we do have, of course, already first ideas on what we observed, and also first publication already published. And on the one hand, just talking about the direct impressions, I mean, I talked about that already a bit. on the one hand, during the winter experience, during the winter period, we experienced much higher temperatures than Fridtjof Nansen did. I mean, I told you that we had our lowest temperatures at about minus 42 degree about 130 years ago, when Fridtjof Nansen was on site, so to say. It was more than 10 years, it was more than 10 degrees colder than it was this time. And also in spring, as I just said, we observed and experienced a super dynamic Arctic sea ice cover, which led to the fact that it took us to drift through the whole Arctic it took us only less than 1 year, while it took Fridtjof Nansen more than 3 years. So those are just like the really direct impressions, which does not really need deep scientific research on it, or like deep diving into the data. But this is, of course, what we also experience. And this, I mean, also this just like this feeling of, okay, we've drifted so fast. This is, of course, also like on a scientific basis. So you can see here just again, like really the drift pattern and the really high dynamics of the sea ice that we observed. We had the possibility, due to the fact that we've been in the middle of winter at the North Pole with a ship. We had the possibility to really observe unknown and hidden winter processes and properties, as for example that we could observe that there is still kind of a healthy cold surface upper layer in the ocean, which kind of gets hope also for the future. When we also get to the point that we can save also the Arctic summer sea ice, because the winter ocean is still kind of healthy. And also, I mean, looking into my personal field of research, we have the possibility now that we have been on site to describe much more detailed how snow is accumulating on sea ice, and what does that mean in terms of fluxes, in terms of energy exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean and the sea ice. So this will be super interesting to deep here much more into detail. And also, as already mentioned, of course, it's not only about the atmosphere, the ocean, and the sea ice, but it's also a lot about fluxes in general, also metafluxes, and also all those trace gases, for example, through the Arctic climate system. However, especially here, really the colleagues are still sitting in their labs and analyzing the data, or like just like getting the data, and are not even at the point for really deep analysis. So this will really take still ages until we get here to really solid results. So just this gives you just kind of a brief insight into those scientific results. And with that, I'm already at the end of my talk, and I hope that I could give you like really some insights into what does it mean to work in the Arctic, what are like the challenges that we observed, and what are the cool facts, like the really the scientific knowledge that we could gather from that expedition. And yeah, I'm happy now to answer question like in either way, like in scientific in a scientific point of view, but also on a personal basis, if you want so. And here are just like now some huge numbers, so to say, from our expedition. And with that, I want to thank you. And as I said, so I would be just now happy to answer any questions that come to your minds.
Thank you so much, Stefanie,